Great. So welcome again, everyone, for another NoBeC talk. My name is Paulius. I am the Managing Director of the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics at the University of Pennsylvania. And we are very happy to have you here again. So for today, we are following our usual agenda. I will give you a short welcome from the center. Then we will have our pre-recorded early career researcher presentation, this time from Nina Weber from King's College London. And then we will have our main talk today by Dr. John Beshears from the Harvard Business School, and then 15-minute questions as always. So as I always do, I wanted to remind you that this speaker series is organized by our Penn Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics. At Penn, we work on consulting, research, and training to help organizations sustainably enact positive behavioral change. And as always as well, I wanted to tell you just a little bit of one of our past projects for you to have an idea of what we do. In this case, it's the sector sustainability check for UNICEF Pakistan. This was a broader effort with the government of Pakistan and UNICEF to do a sustainability check, but we help them in two ways. One, were social norms training for the whole project team. And then we also provided technical research support to develop and analyze social norms measures around the whole check and especially sanitation and water. You can read the full report on our website. I have included it here if you're interested. And this is our remaining list of talks for the summer. Remember that next week we have a special slot. We had to reschedule Professor Villeval's talk, but we will have instead Professor Sylvia Sonderer from the University of Nottingham with a very interesting paper about social norms. And then you have the list, and it's in our website as well. A few ground rules. If this is the first time you join, please keep yourself muted. If you can, please keep your camera on so that we see who's there. And if you can, please change your username to reflect your affiliation as well, to know who's there. We have a co-author here in the audience today, as in previous occasions, so please use the chat to ask any questions. And then at the end, in the question and answer slot, you can use the raise hand function. We are transmitting this through Facebook Live, as always, so the video will be there, and the video will also be in our webpage probably next week, as we have all the rest of our talks. So having said that, I present to you our early career researcher speaker for today. It's Nina Weber she's a PhD student at the King's College London, and her presentation is called Non-Selfish Behavior: Are Social Preferences or Social Norms Revealed in Distribution Decisions? I have included here also her website, and you can scan this QR code to know more about her research. And I think she's also in the audience today. So if you have any questions, comments, if you'd like to connect with her, please write in the chat and you can do it there. So just a moment. I will share the video. Great.
Hi, I'm Nina. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Economy at King's College London, and the paper I'm presenting is on social preferences and social norms in distribution decision experiments. So the basic question we're interested in this paper is, why do people behave unselfishly in experiments? And there's sort of two potential explanations for why that might be the case. The first one is the social preference explanation. It might be that people are simply inequality averse. And the other explanation is that they follow their perceived social norm or the norm of the group. And these two explanations obviously have large literatures associated with them, and they also don't necessarily have to contradict each other. But the contribution of our paper is that we directly elicit both preferences and norms for each of our subjects. And then we essentially run a horse race to see which of these two can better explain behavior in distribution decision experiments. So our experimental design is a survey experiment with about 2,400 subjects. And in our experiment, subjects are asked to take part in a quiz. And part of their payment is based on their relative performance in the quiz, based on hypothetical groups of 5 subjects. Before taking part in that quiz, we ask our subjects to make dictator-like distribution decisions that will determine the payment for each performance level. And they make these choices across 3 different treatments. So we have an impartial spectator treatment, a veil of ignorance treatment, and a non-veil of ignorance treatment, where in the last treatment, subjects have an idea of how well they will perform before they make the distribution choice. Before they make all these choices, we elicit preferences by asking our subjects which principle of redistribution they most agree with. And then we elicit norms through an incentivized Krupka and Weber method. So for simplicity, across all decisions, we restrict the options or the redistributive principle options for subjects to these 4 principles. The first one is inequality aversion. Then we have maximin, meritocracy, and utilitarianism. And these are the principles most commonly referred to in the literature. And we give our subjects these short statements to ask them which of these they most agree with for a principle elicitation. Then in the distribution choice, each of the distributions corresponds to one of the principles. So here for inequality aversion, we have the least variation between the performance levels. For maximin, we have the highest payoff for the lowest performer. Meritocracy is framed in a way that is based on the effort exerted in the quiz. And then utilitarianism is the same as meritocracy. It just has a higher total and average payoff because we increase the payoff of the middle performer by $10. These are main results. So the red bars are the distribution choices subjects make. The green bars are the perceived social norms, and the blue bars are the social preferences. And we can see pretty clearly here that the majority of subjects choose a maximin distribution. And that is also the social norm that most subjects perceive to exist, so maximin. But for the social preference, we actually see that most subjects, but the modal choice is meritocracy. But we then see that actually the fewest number of subjects choose maximin as their social preference. So this seems to suggest that social norms are better at predicting distribution choices than social preferences, at least in the aggregate. We also find this to be the case in individual level models. And so overall, we find that social norms predict distribution choices significantly better than social preferences. And this is the case across all our treatments. But importantly, both can explain some variation. So for example, a subject that holds a preference for meritocracy is 2.6 times more likely to choose that distribution. But a subject that perceives meritocracy to be the social norm is 7.3 times more likely to choose that distribution. Interestingly, we find that our treatments have no significant effect on the principles or norms selected. And we also find that selfishness does not consistently predict distribution choices in our third treatment. So to conclude, our paper provides evidence that social norms predict distribution choices better than social preferences. We also look a little bit at the mechanisms. And we find that subjects who are more ambiguity averse are more likely to follow a social norm, and those that are more confident in their social preference are more likely to stick with that social preference. At the moment, we're looking at some follow-up questions on, for example, the role of culture in this, what happens when we introduce communication and voting, and also spillovers into other decision problems like public goods games. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Great. So thank you so much, Nina, again for your presentation. yeah, so as I mentioned, please feel free to ask Nina any questions or send any comments in the chat. And as mentioned, you can see her website and a QR code that takes you to her website here. And then, so yeah, so just one more reminder that next week we will have our next talk. We usually have a 3-week gap, but this is special time. So next week at the same time, same link, everything, we will have Professor Sylvia Sonderger from the University of Nottingham speaking about a paper called "It's Not a Lie If You Believe the Norm Does Not Apply, Conditional Norm Following with Strategic Beliefs," a paper co-authored with Christina Vicari and Eugen Demand. So we hope to see you. And now I'm going to present today's speaker. So Dr. John Beshears from the Harvard Business School is the Terry F. and Bradley M. Bloom Associate Professor of Business Administration in the Negotiation, Organizations and Markets Unit. He's also a Faculty Research Fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. And before joining the Harvard Business School, he was an assistant professor at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. His primary research area is behavioral economics, and he focuses on understanding how the financial decisions of households and firms are influenced by the institutional environment in which choices are made. He has also explored in recent work participation in retirement saving plans, household investment decisions, and healthcare choices. His research has been featured in a wide variety of outlets and in press, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, The Economist, Business Week, and Time. And as in previous occasions, we will have our core member and associate professor of practice in behavioral science, Dr. Eugen Demand, as the moderator for this session. So thank you so much, John, for joining us, and I give you the floor.
Yes, thanks. Thanks so much, T. Let me pull up my slides here. Harry and I are very excited to present this research to you all. Harry Kosowski is a PhD student at NYU, and we had a lot of fun, but also spent a lot of hours together pulling together this paper. So again, we're very appreciative of the opportunity to present it, and also thanks to Nina for presenting her fascinating research as a way of getting everyone's minds in this space. The paper that I'm going to tell you about is on the topic of nudging, and that is a concept that is familiar to everyone if you've managed to find your way into this Zoom call. But it is good practice just to be very upfront, very clear from the beginning about what we mean, and we're just using the definition of Thaler and Sunstein from their 2008 book. So a nudge is an adjustment to the design of the decision-making environment that changes people's behavior in a predictable way without forbidding any options or significantly changing their economic incentives. It has to be cheap, it has to be easy, and it cannot be a mandate. Now, since that book was published, there's been an explosion of interest in applying nudges to various settings. Here's the famous map from the OECD showing that more than 200 organizations around the world are applying nudging and behavioral insights to public policy. There are also a large number of for-profit organizations that are using behavioral insights, behavioral economics. Just to name the ones that I'm familiar with off the top of my head, there's the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, there's Voya Financial, there's Merck, the pharmaceutical company, there's Deloitte, there's Google, and so and that's just the ones that I'm personally familiar with. So a large number of people are coming around to the view that I think a lot of us share, which is that even if a traditional economic perspective would say, well, a nudge should not matter, it's not really impacting material incentives, we all have the belief that actually it does matter. But given this really amazing amount of growth in the field, in this genre of research and application, Harry and I thought it was a good moment, a little more than 10 years after the publication of the original Nudge book, to try to assess how far we've come, and also think a little bit about where we should probably go next. So this paper really has two objectives. First, we're going to try to assess the first, I'll call it 10 years of empirical research on nudge interventions. And we're going to be asking questions such as what disciplines, domains of application, research settings, and by research setting, I mean in the field, in the lab, via a survey, which kind of areas and spaces have seen work on nudging, what types of nudges have been tested. Defaults come up frequently, social norms, of course, come up. Information about social norms is often coming up as a norm, but there are many others. Which types of nudges have been used in various domains. Importantly, how statistically robust are the effects? And then to the extent that we can start saying something about which strategies are most impactful, we're going to try, because we have enough evidence at this point that we can start to systematize it even a little bit more than we already have. So that's objective number one, if you will, the backward-looking objective. Our forward-looking objective is to use the overview that we've provided from the past 10 years of research to develop some recommendations, use it as a springboard into how we think the next approximately 10 years of empirical research on nudging should be conducted. And some of the recommendations we come up with are going to be something that most people are pretty readily going to agree with, I think are largely going to be uncontroversial. And then as we go along, I think a few of them are a little bit more putting our flag in the sand and saying, no, we think this is something really important that we have not paid enough attention to, but we really think we should be paying attention to going forward. But let's start with that first objective. We're going to assess empirical research on nudging for the first approximately 10 years after the publication of Thaler and Sunstein's book by building a database of research articles on nudging. And at this point, it's probably helpful for me to clarify or be a little bit more precise about how we're defining the universe. So nudges, as I alluded to before, are applied by a large number of practitioners, a large number of organizations. We're going to start with the academic literature on nudging, and then even further kind of limited as I described in this slide. We're going to look at the Scopus database of abstracts and citations, and we're going to take that universe and narrow it down to articles that cited nudge, the Thaler and Sunstein book, or either two precursor articles that we thought were kind of foundational in this field. We're going to further limit then to articles that have at least 10 citations as of the time we looked at Scopus, and that's really just to have a little bit of a sense that these are papers that are having an impact on the field. And then we're also going to require, not at all surprisingly, but to be precise about what we're doing, that the paper reported at least one treatment effect estimate for a nudge intervention, where nudge intervention is as defined by Thaler and Sunstein, and it has to be based on new data. So actually an overview paper or a meta-analysis sort of along the lines that we've conducted here would not count. It would not make it into the database. Neither would a theoretical paper or kind of a policy prescription, unless it is presenting a new data set evaluating the treatment effect of a nudge. That leaves us with 174 articles. And we actually then moved to constructing the database to be at the level of the treatment effect estimate. So out of those 174 articles, we identified 965 nudge treatment effect estimates, where of course one article might be testing multiple treatments, or it might be studying multiple populations of individuals, or the same population of individuals across multiple settings. Maybe there are several distinct, and we require them to be quite distinct outcome variables. So a lot of different ways that a given article could actually generate multiple nudge treatment effect estimates. But that's going to be our database for trying to give a picture of what nudge research looked like in the 10 years following the publication of the Thaler and Sunstein book. It's, of course, not comprehensive. I've explained exactly how we've narrowed our search, although we do think it will be giving us a pretty clear picture, a pretty accurate picture of the types of empirical research on nudge interventions that is gaining some traction in our field. Give you a little bit of a sense of when these articles were published. You can see that really Nudge, the book by Thaler and Sunstein, is the landmark. After that, that's what is not surprisingly, given that we require you cite that book, is marking the beginning of the surge in article counts. And of course, at the end of the sample period, things tail off a little bit. That's just because we've imposed this requirement that there be at least 10 citations on the article. And the more recently an article has been published, the harder it is for that article to generate citations. But then for each of those 965 nudge treatment effect estimates, we're going to read very closely and record the following variables. We're going to ask, in what academic discipline was this article published? Economics would be an example, psychology. In what domain of application was the nudge tested out? So a healthcare situation would be one domain of application. There's financial decision-making, there's decision-making related to the environment. We also look for the research setting. Is it a field experiment, an observational analysis of field data? Is it a laboratory experiment, an internet survey, or maybe some combination of those? We're going to try to record what is the outcome variable that is being targeted in this research, and try to characterize it. Is it an outcome variable that really just represents a discrete action? You either took this action or did not at one precise moment in time, or is the outcome variable capturing more of a summary of a series of actions? To make that concrete, think about an area that I am particularly interested in, retirement savings. A discrete action might be, did you make one contribution at a particular point in time to your retirement savings plan? A summary measure would be, how many dollars have you contributed to your retirement savings plan over the course of a 2-year period, let's say. We're going to record whether or not the nudge automates some aspect of the decision-making process. And as we kind of further dig into how would we describe this nudge, how would we categorize it, we're going to use the taxonomy that I developed in a Harvard Business Review article with Francesca Gino back in 2015 to think about categories and subcategories of nudges. I'll have more to say about that in a moment. We're going to ask whether the researchers collected data that was following up on the initial data collected to evaluate the nudge treatment effect. And if so, did any treatment effect that was detected in the initial data persist beyond that point? We're going to ask, did the research measure treatment effects on outcome variables that were not targeted by the nudge, but they could nonetheless offset effects on those targeted variables? And those could be very closely related, or they could be distantly related. We're also going to ask whether the research tested interaction effects between the nudge treatment effect and another intervention, whether that intervention was a nudge itself, or also or alternatively more of a traditional intervention like financial incentives. And then finally, we try to record some information about that treatment effect estimate itself. What was the Cohen's D for the size of that treatment effect? And then what was the p-value for that treatment effect? And the first thing that we're going to do with this is just provide a broad overview. Where do we see empirical nudge research happening? Across what disciplines, across what domains of application, et cetera. Along with that, we're going to start to ask, how statistically robust is the evidence that there are truly nudge treatment effects in that discipline, or in that domain of application, or in that research setting? And this is a very real sort of a question of real import, because there are always concerns in an empirical field such as ours that the evidence arguing in favor of the existence of nudge treatment effects could be the result, actually, not of there truly being nudge treatment effects, but of some unsound statistical practices and publication bias. And of course, I have in mind the concerns about p-hacking, but more than that, just the notion that if only statistically significant results are published, that can give a very misleading look at what actually these types of interventions are able to achieve. So we're going to use the Simonson, Simmons, Nelson p-curve technology in order to look within an academic discipline, within a domain of application, and say something about how statistically robust the evidence in favor of nudge treatment effects truly being there is. And just to quickly give the intuition behind how that works, if in a given article, or let's say in a given domain of application, you see, if you limit your attention to the statistically significant p-values, those less than 0.05, and you look at the distribution of those p-values across the interval 0 to 0.05, if there is truly no nudge treatment effect, so the null hypothesis holds, what you predict is a uniform distribution of those p-values across the interval 0 to 0.05. And the reason for that is just from the definition of p-value. Under the null hypothesis, which we're kind of thinking to be true for the moment, there's a 5% chance that you get a p-value less than 0.05 by type 1 error, a 4% chance that you get a p-value less than 0.04, a 3% chance you get a p-value less than 0.03. And so the chance that you get a p-value between 0.04 and 0.05 is 1%. And the chance that you get a p-value between 0.03 and 0.04 is 1% again. And you can see that the prediction is a uniform distribution of p-values. Now, if there truly is a nudge treatment effect, you're going to see that the p-values are stacked up closer to 0. If there's some funny business going along the lines of p-hacking, then you can have the opposite, where the p-values are stacked up closer to 0.05. And so our methodology is going to be using the Simonson, Simmons, Nelson formal test for whether there's sufficient stacking up of p-values close to 0 relative to what I'll call the null hypothesis, or the hypothesis that there really is no nudge treatment effect, which predicts a uniform distribution of those p-values. So the methodology here is within a domain of application. Let's say we grab all of the p-values that are less than 0.05. We're actually going to randomly select one p-value per article. And the reason for that is we want exactly one p-value per article to avoid this issue of there being correlation between p-values within the same article. And then we're going to apply the p-curve methodology, and just sort of off the shelf, kindly made available by that trio, Simonson, Simmons, Nelson. And we're going to say, is there enough evidence that the p-values are stacked up close to 0? And just to avoid having the noise from our random selection process influence things, we're actually going to do that random selection of one p-value per article 50 times, each time independently. And then what I'm going to report to you is across those 50 random draws, what fraction of those 50 have a collection of p-values that are sufficiently stacked up close to 0, such that the Simonson, Simmons, Nelson test would conclude we have evidential value for the existence of a nudge treatment effect. So let me, with that, actually, it's very easy to talk about this first set of results. I'll start with academic discipline, and I'll focus your attention on the first column all the way on the left, and then the last column all the way on the right. What the first column is telling us is that nudging really has spread out across academic disciplines. The most popular discipline is psychology and cognitive science. That's representing 27% of our treatment effect estimates. Economics and finance close behind at about 22%. You can see marketing and consumer behavior is also popular, but a really nice spread. So nudging is a topic of interest truly at an intersection of disciplines, where all of these disciplines are kind of coming together into a shared interest. I think perhaps quite reassuringly for those of us who are interested in this topic, you see on the right-hand column that the percentage of p-curves with evidential value for each of those disciplines, and for all disciplines pulled together, is at least 98%, right? So, and in fact, in all but one case, it's 100%, meaning across almost all of those 50 random draws that we did in each of those cases, the p-curve evidence indicates that there's statistically robust evidence in favor of a nudge treatment effect truly being there. Okay, and so what that tells us is that we can be confident, to the best of our ability to tell using this null hypothesis statistical testing sort of framework, that it's unlikely that the nudging literature is purely due to a combination of unsound statistical practices and publication bias. What it does not say, of course, is that there's none of that going on. In fact, there probably is some degree of unsound statistical practices and some degree of a publication bias. And so keep in mind that because of those practices and publication bias, the nudge treatment effects that we see in the literature are probably inflated relative to the truth. But in terms of the existence or non-existence of nudge treatment effects, we have some confidence that they're truly there. So that's the story for academic disciplines. Very similar story for looking at different domains of application and different settings. So health is a very popular domain of application, the environment, another popular domain. And if you look at settings, meaning are we looking at field research more in a laboratory or an online experiment, pretty even split there. But again, just looking at that right-hand column, we should have a good degree of confidence, statistically speaking, that the nudge treatment effects that we're also excited about truly are there in this aggregate sense. All right, now let me move to start thinking about types of nudges. And here, I'm going to really start categorizing nudges along two different dimensions. One is whether or not the nudge automates some aspect of the decision-making process. And what I mean by that is there's some step in the decision-making process that the nudge takes out of the hands of the individual. It doesn't have to be the whole thing, but there's some aspect of the process. To give a concrete example, a lot of you are probably familiar with the nudge that takes information from an individual's tax returns and uses that to automatically populate some of the fields in the application for federal student aid for enrolling in an institution of higher education. Okay, so college or university. And the thing to note there is that, well, there's this part of the process of making the decision to apply for financial aid that is now automated for the individual. But then the individual is going to decide, do I submit the application? Do I fill out the rest of the fields in the application or not? The other way we're going to be categorizing nudges is using this taxonomy from the Harvard Business Review article that Francesca Gino and I co-authored. And the way we thought about it was we wanted to start putting nudges into categories according to how they're hypothesized to operate. And we're going to use this way of thinking about decision-making that Kahneman popularized in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. But of course, a lot of people view things this way. Some nudges might operate by triggering system one, that fast, intuitive way of thinking, of processing information and making decisions. And so those nudges are ones that elicit an intuitive reaction that changes people's decisions, that changes people's behavior. An example of that might be a nudge that triggers an emotional reaction and grabs your attention that way. And actually, because of the emotion you're experiencing, you make a different decision you might otherwise have made. Some nudges engage system two, that more reflective, deliberative mode of thinking slower, more effortful, that we can use to make decisions. And there we think of nudges as prompting people to pause for a moment and reflect and actually engage in that more rigorous way of going about making a decision. An example there would be, let's say, a reminder to follow through on an intention you previously made. You intended to take some action, but the moment wasn't then. When the moment comes, a nudge might send you a reminder, a text message on your phone, and that gives you a moment to pause, reflect, what do I really want to do in this moment? Your system two is engaged, even if only for a moment, and then you go ahead and make a decision, which is different from the one you would have otherwise made. And then finally, some nudges bypass both systems, really kind of taking the decision out of the hands of the individual. And the classic example there would be automatic enrollment in a retirement savings plan, a 401k or a 403b. And in that case, what happens is an employee who does not take any action whatsoever with regard to their employer-sponsored retirement savings plan, maybe they don't even know such a plan exists, the employer says, well, you haven't told us anything, we are going to automatically enroll you, you're going to be contributing at a default contribution rate, invested in a default asset allocation, and you're always free to change, but if you take no action, that's the outcome that's going to be realized for you. So, and then Francesca and I go into the idea that each of these categories has subcategories, but I'm going to skip over that for the purposes of today. A few notes on all of this. Here we're starting to not take nudges as a monolith, but breaking them down. There are a lot of, it's a wonderful zoo, if you will, a lot of different exotic animals, different approaches to thinking about how we can nudge decision making. But a few notes about this particular approach that Harry and I took. One is that we did not treat a given nudge as only triggering system 1 or as only engaging system 2. Some of them might be of that nature, but it was also possible in our way of thinking about it that a nudge, just because a nudge might operate through multiple channels, is simultaneously triggering system 1 and engaging system 2. And the literal coding of that in our data set was we had one variable capturing trigger system 1, another variable capturing engage system 2. And if we thought a nudge did both of those things, each of those variables took a value of 1/2. And this is under the assumption that the nudge did not bypass both systems. If we think a nudge did all three, then each of those three variables would take a value of 1/3. Of course, if a nudge only occupied one of those categories, the one variable took a value of 1 and the other two took values of 0. Another thing to note about this, this coding that Harry and I did is that a nudge automating some aspect of the decision-making process is not synonymous with the nudge bypassing both systems. And in particular, a nudge can automate some aspect of the decision-making process without bypassing both systems, but the reverse is not true. And the example to think about is, again, that nudge having to do with the application for federal student aid. Recall that what happened was information from a tax form is collected and automatically used to populate the as many fields as possible on that application. So that's automation, I've argued, but it's not bypassing both systems because it's still ultimately up to the individual whether they want to make that decision to apply for financial aid or not. Okay, but now that we've done this categorization, we can start to look across types of nudges. And reassuringly, what we find is across all of the types of nudges for which there's a sufficient sample size, there's evidential value for there being truly nudge treatment effects. But now, actually, moving to something that is even a little bit more ambitious, perhaps, we can start to ask which types of nudges tend to have larger effect sizes or more robust effect size or more robust effects than others. And so what we're going to do next is sort of the next stage of this assessment of the past 10 years of nudge research, is we're going to run ordinary least squares regressions where in the first two columns, it's the Cohen's d for the treatment effect size as the outcome variable. And then in the 4 columns on the right-hand side, it's an indicator for whether the treatment effect estimate meets some threshold for statistical significance. And the variables that we're going to focus on the right-hand side are explanatory variables of interest, are 1 in columns 1, 3, and 5, an indicator for whether or not the nudge uses automaticity. And then in columns 2, 4, and 6, we're going to have those variables I was describing a moment ago having to do with the nudge triggering system 1 or engaging system 2 or bypassing both systems. In columns 2, 4, and 6, we do end up dropping the constant, just as a quick technical note. And what we'll see is that actually there's some suggestive patterns when we break across triggering system 1 versus engaging system 2 versus bypassing both systems. But what really starts to stand out pretty clearly is that nudges that use automaticity seem to have certain advantages over other types of nudges. They tend to have a larger Cohen's d. They tend to be more likely to have statistically significant results. And by the way, we're controlling for discipline, academic discipline, we're controlling for domain of application, we're controlling for the research setting, whether or not it uses observation in the field, and we're controlling for the nature of the outcome variable. Is it a dichotomous outcome variable or not? Just to put that these effect sizes in perspective, what we're finding is that, at least according to regression predicted Cohen's d, nudges that use automaticity have a Cohen's d of nearly 0.6, whereas those that do not use automaticity have a Cohen's d of nearly 0.4. And so the difference between those, statistically significant itself, is an increase from the left-hand column to the right-hand column of about 50%. That's pretty substantial. Now, I'll hasten to add, of course, the caveat that this is merely a correlation. It wasn't randomly assigned whether a given research paper used a nudge that has automaticity or not. And in fact, we're probably expecting researchers to try to match a nudge that's appropriate to the domain where they're trying to apply the nudge. But nonetheless, here's where we start to transition to providing recommendations for the future. We think that we've reached the point in the nudge literature that we can start asking ourselves a little bit more rigorously, okay, well, which types of nudges are in general more impactful, or actually perhaps a better version of the question, which types of nudges tend to work in which types of settings? Okay, so that's really recommendation number one. And I'm starting with the I think less controversial recommendations, and we'll get towards ones that are a little bit more aggressive as we go along. We're going to have 5 recommendations in total for this forward-looking part of our paper. We think it's important to start studying more so than we have in the past. This work has already begun, but start thinking about which nudges work in which types of contexts. And one thing I'll mention here is that we're very open to different ways of interpreting this word work, right? What does work mean? We've been operationalizing our exploration in terms of what was the impact on the targeted outcome variable, but nudges might help people in other ways too. For example, even if the ultimate decision that was targeted by the nudge is not changed, people aren't changing their behavior as a result of the nudge, maybe the nudge speeds up the decision-making process for people, just saves them time, and that saves time they can deploy towards all sorts of other wonderful things. So, and we would call that, I think, a valuable nudge. If decisions that people ultimately reach are unchanged, people feel pretty good about them, but they've saved time because the nudge made the decision-making process easier for them. But that's the first thing that we're going to put forward as an important goal for research on nudging going forward. Let's figure out which types of nudges are working in which contexts. Another, I think, but eager to hear your comments and questions, but I think another less controversial recommendation we have is let's embrace that the field has this nice balance between field and laboratory approaches, and let's really view those two approaches to research on nudging as complements. The rationale there being just recognizing that each type of research approach has its own advantages and disadvantages. So laboratory research, running carefully controlled experiments in a laboratory environment or perhaps an online survey environment, that's going to help us explore new nudges that might be that might be really exciting new ways of changing behavior. It can help us identify important psychological effects that would then generalize across contexts. If you're doing research in the field, sometimes you feel that your finding is very much specific to the context. Laboratory research can help us understand the mechanisms through which nudges operate, and then also help us develop predictions regarding which situations are going to be ones where a particular type of nudge is or is not going to be successful. So that's all very valuable. Field research also is going to be able to contribute a lot of value, because I think it's better place to help us understand effect sizes in organic settings. Laboratory experiments, in fact, part of the feature is, one of the draws of them is that you can strip away a lot of extraneous factors. But as a consequence, that might amplify effect sizes because there are no things distracting from the nudge, nothing to draw attention away from the nudge. Field research is going to actually include all of those extraneous factors from the standpoint of understanding the pure nudge, but are important factors to consider when we're thinking about applying nudges to a public policy setting or perhaps a managerial setting. Let me move to the third recommendation that we have. And this one is I think, where we're starting to go against at least the current practice of nudging. So we're going to suggest that we should be doing more measurement of the long run effects of nudges. One way of backing up this claim that this doesn't seem to be the current practice is that when we look at our database of 174 articles on nudging, only 17 of those articles look at a time horizon beyond the initial time horizon that was used to measure nudge treatment effects. And only 24 of those articles look at an outcome variable that might be considered the cumulative impact of a series of actions. So that has a little bit of a long-term flavor to it. 36 out of the 174 articles, so about 1 out of 5, fall in either or both of those categories. And we think we've been pretty generous in what we count as measuring nudge treatment effects over the long run. Okay, and I think we're going to, as we try to speak to policymakers and managers, we're going to generate a lot more excitement, and we're going to have a lot more success if we can start finding nudges or approaches to applying nudges that do have long run impacts. And by the way, it's not that every time we look, we see that, oh, the nudge worked in the short run and it worked in the long run. Some have that property and others do not. But all of a sudden, when we start focusing on, okay, well, how do we generate long run effects from nudges, that just raises a bunch of interesting research questions that we've only begun to scratch the surface on. So we start to think about what mechanisms are the ones by which a nudge might have a long run impact. Harry and I came up with 3 possibilities. This is not an exhaustive list. One mechanism would be if a nudge helps people form beneficial habits. Okay, so you intervene for a short period of time, but you use that time to help people build a habit that then lasts well beyond after you've removed the intervention. I've done a little bit of work on this myself. I think this is hard, but extremely exciting. And it's a wonderful challenge for a group of us to work on. Another mechanism might be if the nudge prompts someone to make an upfront investment that itself has lasting effects. And the example to think about there is, let's say we're trying to get people to conserve energy in their homes. We could say, oh, make sure you turn off the light when you leave the room. That is something you kind of need to remember to do every time. Maybe develop a habit of it. That would be a great way of thinking about it. But an alternative would be, why don't you install an energy efficient light bulb or a bunch of energy efficient appliances in your house? Then all of a sudden you're asking people to make some upfront investment that, even if they don't change their behavior subsequently, is going to have a lasting impact towards our goal of reducing residential energy consumption. And then finally, we can think, well, why apply a nudge just once? We can potentially apply it repeatedly over the course of time to remind people to sort of keep them engaged in the behavior that we think is the right behavior to engage in. And the interesting research question that arises from that is, well, there might be some nudges that bear repetition and other nudges that only work when, say, the first and the second time you use them. So think a nudge that really relies on the element of surprise, like, oh, that's surprising. I didn't think about that, and therefore I'm going to change my decision. A lot harder to surprise people repeatedly over time unless you get very creative about it. So again, this is partly noticing what has happened so far in the nudge literature. There's not so much a critique as a hope for what we can do going forward. And I just think it generates a bunch of interesting questions for future research. Here's another recommendation, one that I happen to think personally is quite important, and it's partly related to some research I've been working on recently that I'll share briefly. I think that we should be measuring the effects of nudges on non-targeted outcomes more frequently than we have been in the past. Again, going back to the database that Harry and I constructed, 12 out of 174 articles studied outcomes in the same domain as the target outcome that could offset the effects of the nudge on the target, and only 3 out of those 174 articles studied outcomes in a different domain, but outcomes that could nonetheless offset effects of the nudge on the target outcome. And to be a little bit more concrete about what I mean here, let me go to my tried and true and I guess personal favorite context, retirement savings. Let's say we develop a nudge, let's call it automatic enrollment, that really impacts our targeted outcome, which is contributions to retirement savings plan. And my work, the work of many others, has documented that automatic enrollment does this quite well. There are theoretical reasons to believe, and it's not just this context. I think the same argument is going to apply to a lot of different places where nudges have been applied. But in this context, there are theoretical reasons to believe that there's at least a chance of offsetting effects in other places. Okay, and what I mean by that is we often think that there are a whole range of psychological factors arrayed against the outcome of people saving and accumulating wealth for retirement. There's present bias or self-control problems. There's all sorts of temptations out there. There's difficulty projecting into the future and understanding this complex set of decisions about how much to save and how to invest it, et cetera. So a lot of psychological barriers to retirement wealth accumulation. We figure out how to conquer those in one particular setting. So we increase retirement plan contributions. But then we need to think about all the other places where people are making personal financial decisions. And in particular, if we increase contributions to a retirement savings plan, maybe people go on spending just as they would have otherwise. And of course, that spending needs to be financed somehow. Maybe people are racking up credit card debt. That would be a bad outcome, I would think. Another possibility is, yes, we've gotten people to contribute to the retirement savings plan, but they go on spending as they would have otherwise. Part of that's financed by withdrawing balances from the retirement savings plan before people reach retirement. Okay, so that's a very important offsetting effect. It's not a targeted outcome. We weren't sort of directly focused on withdrawals when we designed the automatic enrollment nudge, which is all about people putting money into the plan. Yet that provides an important offsetting effect for what would be considered the overall policy goal, which is retirement wealth accumulation. And here's the research that I briefly alluded to that some colleagues and I have been working on. We're studying automatic enrollment, particular flavor of automatic enrollment. It's automatic enrollment in a plan without having a feature that people's contribution rates are ratcheted up over time. And we see, and these are just point estimates I'll focus on, that over the course of 5 years, automatic enrollment, at least point estimate wise, seems to do as we found in other research, which is increase inflows into the retirement plan. But what we also find, and this is actually a statistically significant result, is that automatic enrollment leads to more outflows from the retirement savings plan. And these are outflows prior to people reaching retirement. And there are different flavors of withdrawal. One that's pretty clear to focus on is you just take a check from your retirement plan and it doesn't, you don't save it, at least as far as we can tell. So we see that there is indeed a positive impact of automatic enrollment on cash withdrawals from retirement savings plan, which is an important offset to any positive impact that automatic enrollment had on contributions into the plan. So just underscoring the importance of thinking about other dimensions along which people might be adjusting their behavior that weren't necessarily the ones targeted by the nudge. Now, our final recommendation is that we also need to be thinking about our nudges in the context of other policies. And not surprisingly, given that we're scientists often conducting randomized experiments, that we want to just isolate the impact of the nudge we're most interested in. So we have a control group, we have a treatment group which gets the nudge, and we're judging the treatment effect of that intervention. But as we move toward making policy recommendations, we really need to be thinking about, okay, well, how does the nudge fit in with other policies? And again, it's whether those policies are also nudges themselves or are more traditional nudges or more traditional interventions along the lines of, say, financial incentives. And here we do see that 48 out of the 174 articles in our database are estimating at least one interaction effect between a nudge and another policy. But to underscore the importance of this, we really do care about whether the nudge is a complement to or a substitute for existing policies. So a nudge that simplifies the process of applying for student financial aid, the one that I used as an example before, that seems to be a complement to the existing policy of providing financial aid, right? Because it's one thing to provide financial aid, we can up the impact of financial aid if we make it easier for people to access that financial aid. But automatic enrollment in retirement savings plans, the other example that I've frequently been using, that's turns out a substitute for employer matching contributions. And I have a paper that when you combine with the rest of the literature strongly suggests that. And so especially in this case of substitutes, we really are thinking about, well, do we want to be deploying society's resources towards the nudge or towards some other types of policies? And, you know, even within each of those broad categories, exactly which nudge, exactly which traditional policy would we want to use? And what I've done in another paper, this time with Shlomo Benartzi and several other co-authors, including actually Katie Milkman, Richard Thaler, Kath Sunstein, Maya Shankar, and a number of other colleagues, is we've started to ask, okay, well, if you do have some incremental resources to invest, do we think that the investment in a nudge versus an investment in traditional policy is going to generate a larger impact on the targeted outcome variable? I'll just show you one figure from that paper. What we did is we looked at the domain of retirement savings, specifically nudges and traditional interventions that are designed to increase those contributions into a retirement savings plan. And we asked, per dollar spent on that nudge or traditional intervention, how many incremental dollars of contributions do we get into retirement savings plans? By this metric, the nudges look quite good. The bar at the top is showing you what an active decision nudge, it's generating approximately $100 in contributions per dollar spent on the nudge, whereas the best performing alternative traditional intervention, we're providing people with retirement savings information, we're calculating provide maybe $15 of incremental retirement plan contributions per dollar you spend on providing that information. So if we're in the case of substitutes, then I think these types of calculations are the ones that we're going to be needing to engage in much more frequently, not just what is the impact of the nudge, not just is it statistically significant, and not even just what is the effect size in terms of, in this case, dollars of incremental contributions, but let's compare that to the cost that was needed to implement that nudge versus the cost and the impact associated with alternative policies, and then we can reach wiser policy decisions. So let me end there on both a cautious note and an optimistic note. So the caution is, I think as we increasingly look at the impact of nudges on non-targeted outcomes that might offset the impact on the targeted outcome, as we look over longer time horizons, we're increasingly going to find that nudges might have modest effects. You know, I'm not confident in that, but I think that seems like it's something that we're going to see more frequently going forward. Now, this does not mean that psychology doesn't matter. In fact, again, in the retirement savings example, I think it means that psychology matters a lot in a lot of situations, because what it's saying is that, yes, we might be able to design the choice architecture to change the decisions in one particular setting, but because there is this wide range of settings that we can't possibly tackle simultaneously, there are going to be all sorts of other places where psychology is going to be limiting people's ability to reach the desired outcomes. It also doesn't mean that we should not use nudges. As I was arguing just a moment ago, I think nudges tend to have a very large impact per cost, and so they're going to be a powerful part of our policy toolkit. But again, that's a little bit of a note of caution. The positive, and I think encouraging note, is that the first 10 years of empirical research on nudging have been a success. I think we can say with a good degree of confidence that applying behavioral science to managerial and policy issues does generate changes in behavior. Harry and I then try to provide some recommendations for what we can do going forward. And one way of summarizing it is that we don't just want to ask, well, does the nudge change behavior or not? We want to start asking which nudges are best at changing behavior in an enduring and comprehensive fashion. So thank you again for the opportunity to present this paper. Harry and I are excited to hear your questions and comments.
Great, John. Thanks so much. This was a masterclass in nudging and presentation, so that was great. Harry did a great job in answering many questions along the way. By the way, my internet is a bit spotty, so if I break off, just let me know and I repeat the question. Let me start with two unfair questions of my own while we wait for people to ask their questions. So I'm a huge fan of your work, but also this paper. I think it's so valuable, so useful. And you sort of spoke about these things towards the end in your points 3 and 4, which is, we now know what works well. That's what your paper shows. But how do we think about the next step in terms of supercharging the nudges? Like, how do we make nudges work even better than they do, right? And so one of the critiques that you mention is how short-lived many nudges are, but also how people don't study the longevities of nudging, right? So one of the critiques that Christina Becchieri and I wrote in our norm nudge paper is that nudges are really directed at the individual level. And norms and norm change is more about changes at the collective level. Do you believe that part of the reason why nudges might be so short-lived is that they really just try to find these shortcuts at the individual level, and at some point they'll wear off, or as soon as you take it away and you put the chocolate back where it was, people haven't actually learned a new behavior. They just learned how to avoid the cognitive cost of going to the back of the supermarket. So what do you think about how to supercharge nudges, and what's sort of the way moving forward?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Really, the million or billion or trillion dollar question, and not at all unfair, because I think we are trying to have a discussion now about exactly what we should be doing going forward if collectively we're going to succeed as an enterprise. And of course, big fan of your work on social norms. I do think they, along with other, I'll call them institutional types of changes, are going to hold the answer to how we can have a more sustained impact from nudging. And actually, in a way, maybe I might even suggest that it's not so much a matter of supercharging the nudge, but it's a broader way of thinking about intervention that I think can have bigger impact, right? And so, in some sense, it's not necessarily surprising that thinking about deeper and more systemic change then allows us to contemplate the possibility of larger impacts. But let me just try to give a sketch of a few thoughts on how your suggestion, which I very much agree with, would play out in a particular setting. Again, I spend a lot of time thinking about retirement savings, and so two major barriers to long-run success in helping people accumulate wealth for retirement are the institutions as we set them up for saving, and call them the social norms, the practices that we have collectively around spending, right? And so I'll start with the second. Of course, there's this notion that we consume because we benchmark our consumption against others. That, loosely speaking, is a form of social norm. And if we can start to understand how to shift the social norm a little bit away from consumption and a little bit more towards saving and investment and et cetera, I think that all of a sudden does start to generate a very big long-run impact. A little bit more on the institutional side, and here's where the notion of supercharging a nudge starts to really have more bite. The U.S. retirement savings landscape, which is the one that I've studied the most, actually has some design elements that tend to undermine retirement wealth accumulation. Chief among them is the liquidity, the ease with which people can withdraw their retirement account balances. And it turns out that at least up until recently, the US has been pretty unique in this regard. So if you look at other countries, the ones I happened to look at in a brief paper I wrote a few years ago were the UK, Germany, Australia, Singapore. Other countries with defined contribution retirement savings systems tend not to let you access your retirement savings before you reach retirement. In the US, when you change jobs, or actually under a number of other circumstances, mostly having to do with financial hardship, you are going to be able to make a withdrawal from your retirement account. And you're going to be able to do so at, you'll pay taxes on it and a small 10% tax penalty. But the flow out of retirement plans in the US is actually a quite substantial offsetting effect for anything going in. So just to give a rough ballpark of that, one estimate is that for every dollar going into retirement plans in the US, about 40 cents, up to 40 cents is coming out in the opposite direction in the form of pre-retirement withdrawals. So big drag on retirement wealth accumulation. Now, one thing we could consider doing, and I'm going to stop short of making a policy recommendation here, but let's study even more seriously the notion of making it a little bit more difficult to withdraw from your retirement plan early. And just to give you a little bit of a preview of how I think about this, if I were to move more towards a policy recommendation, the concern with making your retirement wealth less accessible is that, well, then when you have an emergency, you might want to rely on that, but you can't. And so simultaneously, what you should be doing is helping people build up emergency savings. So you're increasing retirement wealth accumulation, you're increasing emergency savings, and then you've kind of covered both of these bases that we care about. So, again, there's the social norms way of thinking about it. What are the norms we have around consumption and spending? And then there's this institutional piece, which then all of a sudden I think does start to supercharge a nudge. So if there's less of an ability to withdraw your retirement savings early, then that automatic enrollment into the plan that gets you contributing into the plan is going to be able to have a bigger impact. So apologies for a slightly long answer, but it's a fascinating question and one I hope we can all keep thinking about.
So it was a beautiful answer and also a beautiful segue to the follow-up. And I just saw that Michael Halsworth is an audience. So when it comes to policy discussions, Michael, feel free to chime in as well if you want. So my follow-up question would be related to your work that you do with David Leibson and these others, right? Where it's so interesting to see how you look at negative spillovers of nudges, which I think is harshly understudied in the literature. And you mentioned that, right? We're so focused on fixing one issue that we underestimate the new issues that this might create, right? So I bike to work every day, so I might feel licensed to take these vacations in Australia more often, right? And I'm not thinking in absolute terms, but I just think I do good, so I deserve good as well. So do you think there's a risk, and also what can we do about that risk and mitigating that in terms of policymakers reading your beautiful paper and saying, look at all these nudges that work so great, let's just apply them, and not so much thinking about the negative spillover that might happen in a domain where people save more in one domain and then spend more in, save more in one domain, spend more in the other. So what do you think policymakers can actually do to avoid and sort of reduce these negative spillovers?
Yeah, so the first answer to your question, which is the indirect answer, is that we as researchers can help out. Let's call ourselves academic researchers. Can help out the policymakers who are often actually also doing research. But the more the research community can start studying these potential spillover effects, the more aware policymakers can be of them. And in fact, best yet to combine them in the same paper, so you barely get a paragraph in before you're confronted with both the positive impact and some negative spillover effects. That's just going to keep everything front and center for the folks who are trying to translate this into a particular policy application. But in terms of what we can do in the design of, let's say, our nudges, is I think we can start to, as soon as you see the possibility, I'll say the first release valves that come to mind are going to be ones that you can study. And so because you can study them, you can start to think, well, are there ways that I can, I'll say, sort of cut off or design the nudge such that it's less likely to produce that sort of spillover effect? And that's admittedly a statement that is not providing a very concrete recommendation. But in a way, what I'm saying is, sort of, as we increasingly become aware of this possibility, I believe what we're going to be able to do is design nudges that are kind of a little bit more comprehensive in their impact. And I'll say, I think this will require an attitude shift, at least a little bit of an attitude shift when it comes to how we approach research. I know that I was certainly a person who when I first started trying to work with organizations running field experiments testing nudges, I'd say, oh, one of the wonderful things we can do here is we just kind of drop in, we give our input on a very small part of the process that your organization has people go through, and we're going to be able to change the choice architecture of that situation to change decision making there. We don't need to worry about other parts of your organization. Now, I think actually it's going to be incumbent on researchers in this area to say, well, I'm going to be asking for a little bit more involvement and a little bit deeper embedding of my research idea into the way you do things. So certainly there's the primary area where we're going to be intervening to change people's decisions. But there's this other place in your process that you have people go through where there's a potential for a spillover and offsetting effect. And I'd like to address that policy to that possibility too. So perhaps working a little bit more closely with organizations to kind of build in that concern.
Great, very, very interesting. Thanks so much. So I would like to open the floor if anybody has a question. We still have some time. I apologize for taking up the Q&A time for my own questions.
I apologize for my long answers.
No, it's great. Any questions from the audience?
And I see a lot of great comments and questions in the chat, which thanks so much to Harry for handling that. And I'm very eager to take a look at all of that afterwards.
Yeah, great. So there are two more comments that maybe Harry can address. I'm also happy to read them out. I see Gianluca just turned on his video. I don't know, Gianluca, do you have anything you want to ask?
Yes, one question. So I'm not an expert on the field, so you could just disregard what I'm saying. But talking with some psychologists, I've heard that this idea that there are just two systems is, I don't want to say too simplistic, but it's just one of the possibilities. And so people talk about people having actually different systems, and I've seen that there is quite a lot of attention into attention, so studying how much attention people give to a certain topic, which speaks in favor of the idea that people have some degrees of engagement of a system too that could actually go on a continuum. And so I was wondering how these could affect your approach.
Yes, that's a point very well taken. Indeed, I find it to be a useful, I guess, heuristic and also way of talking about modes of decision making, the system one versus system two distinction. But certainly, both intuition and of course research indicate that the way our brains work is a lot more nuanced than that. I do particularly like this idea that, well, there are degrees of attention, degrees to which system two might be engaged in a particular setting. In the Harvard Business Review article that Francesca and I wrote, we tried to acknowledge that this is one, albeit a popular way of thinking about the approaches people take to making decisions, and we're going to use it as a way of creating, call them, I think they're reasonable, but certainly not perfect categories of nudges. And I would absolutely embrace future work that tries to draw finer distinctions, be a little bit more careful about how these lines are being drawn, because I think that could make a big difference in terms of identifying, like, this nudge really is targeted at this particular type of decision making, and so it's going to be very powerful when the decision at hand is one where people are using that type of decision making apparatus. So thank you. I embrace your point and kind of the embedded suggestion.
Perfect. So we are exactly on time to conclude. I would like, John, thanks so much for coming and presenting. I would also like to thank Nina for a great video that she sent to us ahead of your talk. Go check out the papers, both Nina's and John's. And thanks so much for coming. Come back next week if you'd like to hear more about norms and behavior change. And yeah, stay safe, everybody, and see you soon.